My name is Scott. I'm a security person. So my background is working in traditionally security consultancy roles, more recently in security training. And I specialize and kind of focus on one topic in particular, which is what we're going to talk about today. Now, this is a technology that all of you definitely use, whether you realize it or not. It's a technology that works so well, it just kind of works invisibly in the background. And we're going to be talking about a protocol, an encryption protocol called TLS, which is short for Transport Layer Security. And we refer to the transport layer as the communication channel between two devices, so typically Wi-Fi, phone lines, internet connections. And it's what provides us the security of those communications over the transport layer, hence transport layer security. And we all use this every single day. If you have your smartphone out, you have your laptop out, you're using TLS because you are probably communicating with something else. If you go to the supermarket, you tap your payment card or you tap your phone to pay for something, you've used TLS to encrypt that transaction. If you do anything, almost anything in your day-to-day life, I bet that you've probably either directly or indirectly depended on this protocol to secure your communications. But how does it work? The first time that I want to communicate with someone, I don't know who you are or even perhaps where you are, but somehow I now have this requirement to create a secure communication channel with you. So to start with nothing and then create a secure encrypted connection. And we've had this requirement for basically as long as we've had people. For as long as we've had people, we've had the requirement and the desire to be able to communicate with each other in a private way, in a secure fashion, where I can talk to you and tell you something and then other people whom it doesn't concern don't get to know what we're talking about. And we don't have to go back far, just a few decades, to kind of imagine how this would work in a typical day-to-day scenario. If I want to speak with you and tell you some private or secret thing or talk with you about something that's, generally nobody else's business, we'd perhaps find like a quiet corner in the pub and we'd speak in hushed tones, right? And our communications would remain between the two of us. And we would be able to communicate in this secure fashion. Now, the problems start to come in when especially the distance over which that we want to communicate increases and we start introducing technology in the middle. Because now it's very difficult for me to meet most of the people that I want to speak to in the pub. They're generally not even necessarily in the same country or even on the same continent. So not only has the distance over which we typically communicate increased, the frequency with which we communicate with people has increased, and also just the number of people that we communicate with has increased. And if we look at a modern scenario of this now, we can start to see where the problem comes in. If I'm communicating with someone who is thousands and thousands of miles away via messages or email or whatever the communication medium is, how do we ensure that those communications remain secure? And it might not be because you're sending someone messages about state secrets or you're a government spy or something, right? It's just a kind of basic expectation. If I'm sending an email to someone, then me and that person are the only people that should be able to read it. Now, if we want to look at how we've traditionally done this, for one of the first examples that's widely believed to be the first example of people trying to communicate securely, some people do contest this, and that's fair, I can see that. But we can go back a little over 4,000 years to see what is, believed by some. I haven't met many ancient Egyptians to ask them, so I can't 100% say for sure. But they found some hieroglyphs, Egyptologists found hieroglyphs on the tomb of Numhotep II, which were written a little over 4,000 years ago. And when they looked at these hieroglyphs, it was well, we've never seen them before. It's we understand all of these and all of those, and all of these things all make sense, but these ones, no idea, never ever seen them. And one of the kind of two main contending theories is that they wanted to write information in a language that typical people would not understand. So they created a new set of hieroglyphs. And it's right, well, we can write these, and then only certain people that understand the meaning of these glyphs will be able to read the message. So, but this is contested. Like I say, some people are, go one way or the other, whether this was intended to be, some new secret language, or whether they just invented some new words and we just didn't know what they were. But if we go forward 1,000 years, we can find what we all agree was definitely the first attempt at having some form of secure communications. How am I going to communicate with someone And I really need to keep the message a secret if it falls into enemy hands. Now, this was called a scytale. And what would happen is you would take a batten of wood and you would wrap a strap of leather around it. Sometimes it could be paper, but typically leather. And then you would write your message on the batten whilst rotating it. And then when you unwind the strap of leather, you would just have a big long strap of leather with just complete nonsense on it. And then you could send that message to, typically it has military connotations when we talk about secure communications. This was used to deliver messages to military generals in the field. If the messenger was intercepted and the enemy got hold of the leather strap, they'd look at it and be like, what is this? But the general receiving it knows, right, I have to take it and I have to wind it around this wooden batten. And also I need to know the diameter of the batten, right? Because obviously if you change the diameter, it will not line the text up. And this was how early kind of ancient Greeks and Roman generals received their orders in the field. Now again, if we come forward another 1,000 years or so, we get to the Caesar cipher. So this was, again, widely used in a military context. And the Caesar cipher was a basic shift cipher. So you would pick a number that you were going to shift all the letters in the alphabet by. So you would write your message, and then you would choose your shift, and be like, right, we're going to move every character 6 characters over. And you would shift every single character 6 characters over. And again, you would end up with, in today's modern world, what we would call the ciphertext, like the protected version, the encrypted version. And then you could give that to the messenger could deliver that to military commanders in the field. And again, if they were intercepted or, kind of captured, the goal was that whoever captured them would not be able to read the message because they wouldn't know how to decipher the message. Now, all of these, if we can call them encryption systems, all of these encryption systems have the same kind of problem. They have the same inherent flaw in them. And they all rely on something that this would be the modern day equivalent of having happened first. If I want to use any of those systems to be able to communicate with you securely, I have to have previously met you or spoken with you and exchanged some kind of information. Right? If we look at the hieroglyphs and we accept that, I would have had to have given you the meaning of the hieroglyphs in advance, and then at a later time, I can send you the message. With the scytale cipher, I would have to speak to you in advance and say, I'm going to send you this message, and I'm going to use a wooden batten with this diameter. So you need to use a wooden batten with this diameter to decrypt it. And the same with the Caesar cipher. I would have to say to you before you were deployed, right, whenever I send you a message, I'm going to use a shift of 12. Right? And then when you get it, you shift it back 12. Now, the modern day equivalent would be, I would have to meet you and shake hands in some dark secret alleyway, and we would have to exchange a USB drive with an encryption key on it. And then we can say, right, now we've exchanged our encryption keys. In the future, we will now use these encryption keys to talk to each other. If we look at possibly one of the most kind of famous and at least in kind of popular culture, encryption devices, even Enigma had this same underlying requirement. So you couldn't just take an Enigma device and give it to like a submarine captain. They call them captains? Give it to a submarine captain and be like, okay, you sail off into the ocean and we'll just be able to send you secret encrypted messages. They had to give them the Enigma device, and then this thing on the table just in front of it is the code book. And it would say, on this day, at this time, we're going to change from the previous code to this code for the day. And then tomorrow, we're going to change to this code. And then the day after, and so on. So even with Enigma, they had to have this prior communication. They had to have this previous exchange of something in order to then have secure comms. Now, they knew that this was such a flaw in the system that these code books were generally printed on pink paper with water-soluble red ink. So that if the boat is boarded or somebody's capturing the submarine, you could just take a cup of water, throw it on the book, and once the red ink spread onto the pink paper, it would be completely illegible and the device would still be secure. So they knew that this was a problem. We have to have this information that we need to share before in order to have secure comms. But if I ask all of you now to open your phones and go to Netflix or YouTube or Facebook, you've never previously spoken to them and said, okay, right, like if I ever make a secure connection to Facebook, like this is our code book, this is our encryption key. We have to be able to create them nowadays on the fly. And this is largely a problem because of just the sheer size of the network that we communicate over, the frequency with which we communicate with different entities. This would be a completely just inappropriate solution. It's not scalable. We couldn't possibly have all of these previous communications with entities to share these codes, these ciphers, these shift numbers. We have to be able to create secure connections without any prior communication. And that's really difficult. Now, we use more encryption on the web now, on the internet, more broadly, than at any point in history. And it wasn't a steady progression to the sheer amount of encryption that we use. We first got encryption on the web in 1994. So the first time that any of you saw a padlock in an address bar was 1994. And from 1994 all the way through until about 2013, we saw the rate of encryption that we were using increase at roughly 1% more traffic per year. We just about got 1% a year. And then in 2013, the trend line on the graph changed. Does anyone know why? Shout it out if you know. Or who, should I say who? Close. I mean, they're one of the big reasons that we don't like it. Yes, Snowden. So we're all doing all these communications over the internet and we're using a relatively small amount of encryption. And everyone just kind of assumed, well, no one's really looking, right? Like, who's reading my emails? I'm just emailing my friends or my boss or my colleagues. Nobody's looking at my messages. I'm not a government spy. Like, why would anybody want to read my messages? And the Snowden revelations happened in 2013. And then actually it was like, oh, somebody is looking. Somebody is monitoring. Somebody is reading all of my emails. Even though I haven't done anything wrong, and even though I'm not suspected of having done anything wrong, somebody is looking, monitoring, and observing. And not only that, but as we later found out, recording. There's a big difference between being monitored and being recorded. So this was the changing point. This is when the trend line on the graph changed from this minor incremental 1% a year increase in the amount of encryption that we use, and that's when we got the hockey stick. From 2013 onwards, the graph changed trajectory. And we needed to use more and more encryption now that we understood the threat and the risk that exists. Now, of course, we already had it in place. And this is a common theme in all of these examples, is that we already had the solution to the problem. It just wasn't widely deployed because we didn't really understand. And then Snowden happens and we're like, oh, now we understand how bad it is. Let's start deploying encryption. Now, the previous way that we used to establish these encrypted and secure connections was to utilize something, as I said, that we already had. If anyone here has ever dealt with setting up HTTPS on a website and certificates and keys, you'll have heard of this concept of a key pair. All websites have a key pair. In this particular case, we'll say this is an RSA key pair. And a key pair has the two keys. You have the public key and you have the private key. So the public key goes in the certificate. If you've ever had to buy and deploy a certificate, you'll know all about this. The private key stays on the server, and as the name implies, that's the private one. That's the one that nobody should know. Now, one of the cool things about asymmetric keys like this is that something encrypted with one of these keys can only be decrypted with the other. So if, let's say, Anders in the front row here sends me his public key, I can encrypt something, a message, with that public key, and then I can send it back to him. And all of you in this room will have observed the public key in transmission, and you will observe the encrypted message go back. And you can't do anything with the public key. Because if it was encrypted with the public key, it can only be decrypted by the private key. And if you keep it private, as the name implies, then that basically means only Anders can decrypt that. And you think, okay, problem solved, cool. We just, that's it, ta-da. The problem is, asymmetric encryption like this is vastly computationally expensive to do. And if you were to try and take any even small amount of data and encrypt it and decrypt it with this process, the CPU costs and the performance degradation would be phenomenal. So it's just not suitable for any quantity of data. And something like a 4K movie on Netflix, if I'm watching that, qualifies as a significant quantity of data. So we do use this trick of asymmetric keys like this, but we use it to establish what we call a symmetric encryption key. So we used the trick of asymmetric encrypt with the public key and decrypt with the private to share this key with each other. Now, if any of you are familiar, this would be something like an AES key in modern cipher suites. And AES, symmetric encryption, is super high performance. So now we can take that 4K movie that I want to stream from Netflix, and with symmetric encryption, we can encrypt and decrypt that no problem. Right? If you go to your phone right now and you were to go and literally start streaming like a 4K movie, the movie stream is being encrypted and decrypted on the fly by your phone. That's how lightweight symmetric encryption is by comparison. You can take any amount of data that you want and pump it across the network as fast as you want, and the device at the other end will be able to decrypt and encrypt on the fly. So we have like this super high performance encryption, and using the trick of asymmetric from the previous slide, we can share this key with each other now. We have the asymmetric encryption effectively to bootstrap and get to symmetric encryption. And the way that we distribute the public key from the server is easy. Like I said, if you've ever got a certificate for your websites, for your APIs, for your anything else, the certificate contains your public key. So when you go to netflix.com, they send you the certificate back that says, this is definitely netflix.com, and you're like, cool, I'm in the right place. Here is our public key. And you're like, cool, I've now got the thing that I need to do what we call the key exchange. So historically, you would then create some key material, encrypt it with the server's public key, and send it back to the server, and the server can decrypt it and recover it. And now we have this shared key. Sounds nice and simple. It's pretty straightforward. That's exactly how it works, but it has an inherent flaw. And this is the method that we used all the way from 1994 onwards, all the way up until 2008, and still even somewhat widely today, even though we shouldn't. It was the exact key exchange method that we used. This is how we established secure connections. But the problem was, when we look at the Snowden revelations, we learned quite a few different things. Not only were they looking at our traffic and reading my emails or my messages or whatever, but as I said, they were also recording. Now, they had a project called Prism, which when they were looking at all of this internet data just flowing across the internet, they were also piping off a copy and storing it. They looked at it, and basically it was like, wow, there's so much that we can't do real-time analysis because there's just so much stuff. And I guess, cool, we can afford hard drives, right? We'll just pipe a copy off, stick it in a data archive, and then if we ever need it, it's there, right? It's problem solved. So, and this is what Prism did. So the NSA had enormous data storage facilities, and they're like, we'll just record all the stuff, even if it's encrypted, right? We'll just record it, we'll stick it in the archive, and it's there if we need it. And then Snowden happens, and the we need it part came up. Now, they found, shortly after Snowden fled, they found that he used a particular email provider, and this email provider was called LavaBit. Now, LavaBit specialized in the provision of encrypted and secure email. So it's pretty obvious why Snowden was using them. He obviously wanted his emails to be secure. So the NSA are like, okay, we found this out about Snowden. He's using this email provider. Go into the archive, pull out all of the traffic, and let's take a look. Now, they were true to their word, and it was all encrypted properly. So all the NSA now have is a whole bunch of stuff that's encrypted, and they can't read. And they're like, okay, can we break the encryption? Right? Can we spin up some of our supercomputers and just crack the encryption on these emails? And it's like, yes, but you're going to have to come back in like 30 years, right? We're going to need literally like 30 years to do this, decades and decades and decades of just raw compute power. And they're like, okay, that's not going to happen. So they were like, what's the next step? And it's like, well, could we crack the individual session keys, the symmetric keys? Same problem, exact same time frame. You're going to need a supercomputer and decades to break this properly configured encryption. And then they were looking at it, and it was like, well, we've recorded the whole connection. We've recorded all of the traffic. And at the part of the connection at the beginning, when we're setting it up, we used this asymmetric key to protect what we refer to as the key material. So the client will encrypt some key material with this public key and then send it to the server. And the server can decrypt it because the server has the private key. And the NSA can't decrypt it because they don't have the private key. So all the NSA need to decrypt all of the emails is the private key. And then they were like, well, where's the private key? Well, the private key's on the server in the data center. And it's like, is there anything that we can do about that? And it turns out they can. They just whip up a couple of court orders and turn up at the doors for the data center, like, hi, encryption keys, please. And then what? Because it's like, well, we can't really, fight this. They have guns. We're not going to hold the door shut or something. And legally, there's no recourse. There's no option. There's no anything that you can do with this. The NSA rock up at the doors, knock on the door, and they're like, please give us this. Please give us your private key. Now, the problem with this is, if we replay that exact scenario of the NSA going into their archives, pulling out the encrypted traffic, but now they have the server's private key because they've compelled them to hand it over, decryption of all of those emails becomes trivial. Because at the start of the connection, the key material was recorded, but it was recorded encrypted with the public key. And it's like, well, that's cool. We now have the private key. So decrypted. Now we've got the key material, we can generate the symmetric key, and that is the key that you use to decrypt the communications. Now the problem with this is, and I use this phrase and kind of acknowledge that it's not strictly accurate, but essentially, what we're now saying is there is a master decryption key. And if any of you here are kind of encryption people, you'll know that that's not strictly accurate because it's not exactly the case. However, I'm sure you can also agree, you can see what I mean, right? Like if the attacker gets this key, they can decrypt all the stuff. If the attacker doesn't get this key, they can't. That kind of sounds like a master decryption key to me. And this was the problem that we realized with the mechanism that we've been using to establish these secure connections for decades, is that we basically have a master decryption key that it's our responsibility to look after. If you keep this key a secret, if you keep this key safe, all of your communications are secure. If you lose this key, if you get a court order from the NSA, if you throw the server hard drive in the bin and don't properly scrub it, it doesn't matter what it is. If you lose this key, if someone comes into possession of the private key from the server, all of your encrypted traffic and all of your effort is gone. And it was like, wow, that's actually a really bad idea. Because who's perfect? Is anyone here going to say, we will never have an incident, we will never have a breach, we will never get hacked, we will never make a... You can't. No one can say that. Now, unfortunately, bearing in mind that Snowden happened in 2013, there was another major incident that made headlines in 2014, just a year later. Anybody remember any big news headlines from the encryption world in 2014? Anyone? Anybody know what this is? Heartbleed. Right? So the Heartbleed bug rocked up in 2014, if anybody remembers the news headlines from back then, 10 years ago this year. And Heartbleed was a bug in the OpenSSL crypto library. And it is the most widely used crypto library on the planet. It was then, and it still is now. So if you were running a website, an API, any kind of server that did TLS and did secure comms, there was a really good chance that you were using the OpenSSL library to do the crypto. And the Heartbleed bug in that library allowed any stranger on the internet to rock up at your server and effectively just download a copy of your private key. They could only download it in small pieces, but they could potentially download a copy of your private key. So now we went from looking at the NSA scenario where they compelled the handover of one single key that impacted one single organization. And a year later, we're like, oh, the Heartbleed bug's come along and 70% of websites on the planet have now potentially had their private key stolen. Their essentially master decryption key. And this was one of the big turning points. It was like, okay, we need to solve this problem because we've now proved that we can't look after these keys. We can't keep this private key private. We can't guarantee that. No one can. So we need to come up with a solution. Now, the funny thing is, bearing in mind, Snowden 2013, Heartbleed 2014, the white paper that was written that contained the solution was published by these guys in 1976. And it was deployed and supported across the whole internet TLS platform in 2008. Right, so we're literally 6 years prior to where we are in the timeline now. The answer had been around since the 70s, and it had been supported on the web platform since the 2000s. But the adoption of it was really, really small. Now, these two kind of mathematicians, cryptographers here, Whitfield Diffie, Martin Helme, created something called the Diffie-Hellman key exchange. So the key exchange mechanism we were looking at just a moment ago was the RSA key exchange. And it has this fatal flaw that if you get hold of the private key, you can decrypt all of the traffic. The Diffie-Hellman key exchange does not have this fatal flaw. But the problem that we have to overcome is we're back to the communicating some piece of information in the outset. How do we share a piece of information across a connection that's not yet secure? You have to remember the thing that we're trying to do is secure the connection. To secure the connection, we need the key. And right now, we're before having a key. So the Diffie-Hellman key exchange has to happen on an insecure connection, but still remain secure itself. Now we're going to look at how this works. We're going to do some maths. Not a lot, and it's very easy. If any of you have your laptops or you've got a scientific calculator handy, you can follow along. Or if you've got your laptop, you can go to Wolfram Alpha and use their scientific calculator. The client and the server agree on a couple of parameters. And they agree on these parameters publicly, right? So we, totally out in the open, totally public. It's like, okay, we need a prime. So I've chosen a small one here because I want it to fit on the screen and I don't want it to look terrible when we do some equations in a minute. So I picked a relatively small prime. And then we need the generator, which is G. Now you can figure out the generator by just doing primitive root modulo whatever your prime is. So primitive root modulo 191. And that will give you your generator. So you just figure that out, you calculate it. Now these parameters are agreed by the client and the server in public. So the attacker can have these and the attacker can know these. But then using these two numbers, the client and the server do a couple of calculations and send each other some data. So we're going to watch the process. We're going to figure out how this works. So we have the client and the server communicating. And above the line, I'm going to put everything that is public, everything that is sent across the network. So everything above this line represents what the NSA would be able to see if you did this now, right? They're watching what you transmit. Now on the client and the server, the next thing that you do is generate two private numbers. These will be numbers that you generate that you do not persist on disk. You do not store them, you do not reuse them, you don't tell anybody them. They just exist in memory for the duration of the calculation that we're about to do. So I pick 192 here for the client and 247 for the server. Now, once you've picked your private numbers each that you're never going to tell anybody and you're never going to write down, we need to calculate two values. So the client is going to calculate the client public value, which we're going to send in a minute, and the server needs to calculate the server public value that it will also send in just a minute. And that's it, that's all we do. So we take the generator, raise it to the power A, and then modulus it with whatever P was. So if we substitute in the numbers, we can see the calculation that we need to do. So the client's public value will be 19 to the 192nd power, mod 191, and the server public will be 19 to the 247th power, mod 191. If any of you have Wolfram Alpha handy, you can double check my maths here. I double checked them earlier, it looked good. And these are the numbers that you will come up with. So the client has done this calculation locally, the server has done this calculation locally. And this is the point at which we'll transmit these values to each other, hence client public and server public. These are the bits that we're about to transmit. So because we're going to transmit them, we'll stick them up at the top. The attacker can now know these two values. And then we have to do the same process again, but just with a very, very slight change. So now, the client, of course, has received the server's public value, right? The server has just sent server public. And the server has received client public because the client has just sent client public. And then we do it again. We raise it to the power of our private number and modulus it again with P. So if we substitute in the values, you can see that the server's public value that was sent to the client is 142, and that the client's public value sent to the server was 170. Raise it to the power of our private number, and again, mod it with 191. And this is when things get interesting, because now we both have this. We have what we refer to as a shared secret. This is a number now, 109, that I know, the client, and the server knows, but the attacker, right, look up at the top. What does the attacker have? Well, the attacker has P and G. They were agreed right back at the beginning. The attacker has the client public and the server public. But they don't have this. They don't have our shared secret. Now we have exchanged a value with each other over a connection that is not secure, and I know it and you know it, and the NSA don't know it. And this is the magic of the Diffie-Hellman key exchange. With no prior communication, with no previous meeting with you, we have now established a secret that the attacker does not know. And if I give you back all of the original values that we were just working with, these are what the attacker will observe on the network. So now you have to take those 4 and try and tell me what the shared secret is. And we're back to the age-old problem of, OK, give me a supercomputer and 30 years, and I'll come back and tell you. Because short of you knowing A and B, that is your next option, is to take a supercomputer and just try and do the maths. Just try and brute force this by substituting in as many values as you can, as fast as you can, until you find the ones that make sense. Now, the Diffie-Hellman key exchange gives us something that we refer to as forward secrecy. This is a phrase that we use to refer to if there is a compromise of the private key on the server in the future. This is not going to result in the compromise of the security of our traffic. Because in those calculations that we just did, where did we talk about the private key on the server? Where did we talk about the public key on the server? And the answer is that we didn't. We didn't use them. We didn't use the public key to protect anything. We didn't use the private key to protect anything. So now if an attacker comes back to this problem, it's like, OK, cool. I've got the public key and the private key. And it's like, awesome, but we didn't use them for anything. So, whatever, it doesn't matter. This is the protection that the Diffie-Hellman key exchange gives us. If you have this private key on your server and someone compromises it, we have Heartbleed version 2, the NSA comes knocking at your door, GCHQ are just down the road, maybe they'll come and knock on our door. It doesn't matter, you can hand over the key. And when you hand over the key, the amount of traffic that will be decrypted will remain at 0. So we now have the ability, using the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, to establish secure connections without any prior meeting. And the mathematic trick behind this is really simple, because if you look at the calculation that the client did, and then you look at the calculation that the server did, you can see that they're the same thing. Obviously, if we flip the order of the exponents there, it's not going to change anything, because they're both doing this. Ultimately, this is all that's happening under the hood. And that allows us to create our shared secret. Once we can communicate this value to each other without any prior meeting and handshaking with USB drives and encryption keys or code books, we can now, over the open internet, create secure connections from thin air, from nothing. And this is what we call, if you've ever worked with TLS cipher suites, you may have seen something like this. This is the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, and that is how it works. Now, if you have played around with cipher suites, what you're more likely to have seen is this one, the Diffie-Hellman ephemeral key exchange. And all this refers to is that the 2 parameters, A and B, that we just talked about, they have to be ephemeral parameters, which means you cannot store them, cannot reuse them, you cannot persist them. For every single connection that you do now, assuming the server's configured properly, you will generate a fresh set of parameters and share a fresh secret for that connection. So even in the theoretical scenario where somebody breaks the encryption on this connection, all they can read is the one email that you sent this time. If they go to your next connection 10 minutes later when you send your next email, back to the drawing board, back to square one. So Diffie-Hellman ephemeral is what really gives us the protection that we need. If you want to go faster, if you really care about performance, and you should, then you should be using elliptic curve, Diffie-Hellman ephemeral, or ECDHE. The maths for this one is a bit too hard to go through. I also have time limits on this talk. So that's why I showed you DHE, which is a slightly older variant. It's still perfectly secure. So from a security standpoint, we have 0 concerns. Our concerns come from a performance standpoint. If you compare DHE and ECDHE, night and day, right? Like DHE is really slow. ECDHE is blisteringly fast by comparison. But it doesn't matter. Like the thing that we're looking for from both of these key exchange mechanisms is forward secrecy. This is the phrase that we use to refer to the fact that if that private key is compromised, it results in no compromise of our traffic. We did have it was called perfect forward secrecy. We did have a different name for this. So if you've ever seen in books or literature or older talks, you might see perfect forward secrecy mentioned. That was the same thing, but we just realized the name was a bit stupid because nothing's perfect. We can't call it perfect forward secrecy. So the perfect part is dropped. Forward secrecy is the same thing. And it all comes back to, we've had support for DHE and ECDHE since 2008. So you've been able to use this technology since 2008, right? Snowden happened in 2013, Heartbleed in 2014. And it's like, well, we already had the answer to this, but now we have the understanding of why we need it. And the adoption of DHE and subsequently ECDHE then followed another hockey stick trend, right? Like again, it's like, oh, the bad thing happened and now we understand that this is really important. Now we'll do it. And it would be great if we could do the hockey stick before the really bad thing happened. So then when the bad thing happens, like we already have the solution widely deployed, but that's just not how it works. I don't know why, I don't agree with it. I'm working really hard to change it, but it's really easy to convince people to install better locks on their house right after they've been burgled, you know, and it's just, I think it's just human nature. So we continue to go down this path. If we look at the usage of this technology of forward secrecy, then adoption is still not really where it should be. I don't think that anybody should be using a key exchange mechanism that doesn't have forward secrecy, like the RSA key exchange. Can you guarantee that you will never lose this key, you will never make a mistake, that you will never, you know, have a human work for you? Because that's basically what this all comes back to. So looking forwards, we can go back in history and look at all of these events when it's like something terrible happens and we already had the solution available, just not widely deployed. And then it's like, oh, well, are we doing that now? Like, what solutions do we have available now that are not widely deployed, and we're just waiting for the really negative event to get the hockey stick on the graph? And one of the things that really worries me is this phrase was coined, which is record now, decrypt later. Now, if we look at the PRISM program from the NSA, Snowden revelations happened in 2013. Clearly, the program was fully deployed and fully capable, and they just dove into the archives and pulled out the emails. So this wasn't like some brand new thing. It was clearly like a well-established capability that they had. And then you think, well, if they had this well-established capability in 2013, is that capability likely to have got better or worse over time? Did they just shut this down and think, you know what, we don't want to read everybody's emails anymore, we'll just stop doing this? And I'm like, probably not. Right? These capabilities have probably only gotten bigger. And now we do more stuff online, right? We communicate more frequently online. So not just the amount that they're recording has gone up, the amount of stuff that there is to record has gone up. And it's like, okay, well, if we look at the things and the technologies that we're using now, and they're recording it, where are we going to be in 5 years? Where are we going to be in 10 years? If you send an email right now and it's encrypted and it's secure, how far into the future do you want to get before there's a good chance that somebody's reading your email? Because all encryption is breakable. There's no such thing as perfect encryption or perfect security. The question is, how far into the future do you want to get before you would feel comfortable that somebody might be reading your email? Now, the goal for most of the crypto that we deploy and use today is about 30 years. Like we're hoping that 30 years from now, you know, it should still be okay, but it might not be. And the truth is we don't know, because obviously we don't have a crystal ball. But it's the aim that we're hoping to achieve. Now, the big thing that's kind of pushing back against that is quantum computers. This is the next thing that everybody seems to be exceptionally concerned about at present, is how soon will somebody have a viable quantum computer that they can dedicate to the purposes of trying to break encryption? Because if they're recording now, and have been for the last 10 years since the Snowden revelations at least, I assume, if somebody can build a viable quantum computer 5 years from now, 10 years from now, does anyone have a good guess on when there will be a viable quantum computer? But all of the encryption that we're using today is not going to stand up to one of these things. Right? If you're sending those encrypted messages and emails and doing whatever it is that you do online, and somebody's recording it now, they're going to be able to decrypt it in a lot sooner than 30 years if someone can build a viable quantum computer to do that. And that's the big if, that's the big question. Now, of course, the standards bodies and everyone already knows this. We know that quantum computers are coming. We know fundamentally how they operate. Therefore, we know what we need to do to combat them. And the standards bodies have been working on post-quantum cryptographic primitives for a long time now. And this year now, in the last kind of 6 months and into this year, we're starting to see the first deployments and tests of post-quantum primitives on the web. Right? If you're using the latest version of Chrome, there is a setting in the settings menu that you can go to enable the test for post-quantum primitives. So if your browser goes to a website that is also part of the test, then you can both be using these post-quantum primitives on your communication to see if this works at scale, to identify problems, any issues. Now, if our deployment and our adoption of these post-quantum primitives follows all of the previous trends of all of the things that I've just talked about, we'll all probably start using them when someone has a quantum computer and breaks some encryption. And that is completely the wrong time to start using these post-quantum primitives. We need to see much more rapid and widespread adoption of them now before the threat is real. Right? We have, lots. I use this phrase all around the world when I do talks and training, but it's like closing the stable door after the horse has bolted. And that might make a sense, a lot of people here kind of UK-based, I guess, but I say that in different countries and they look at me funny, like, what does this mean? Anyone here Dutch? Yeah, it's like cover the well after the cow falls in or something is the Dutch equivalent. Yeah, so there's like different, there's like different versions of that phrase. So insert your cultural equivalent phrase for closing the stable door after the horse has bolted. So my hope, my goal is to try and make sure that this isn't the case. Once these post-quantum primitives are standardized, we need to start seeing widespread adoption before the problem exists. We're really good at fixing things once we get bitten, right? Once the stuff hits the fan, it's like, oh, we need to go fix this now. It would be way better if we could do this sooner. So for me, my goal is to try and raise awareness of this, to try and push for the standardization of these primitives, to encourage people to test them, to use them. If you're on the most modern version of Chrome, go and turn on the trial. See what happens, see if anything breaks. Hopefully it doesn't. We're pretty late in the process now. You shouldn't really see any issues. But it is coming. Post-quantum primitives are coming and quantum computers are coming. And if we just keep doing the same thing and only fixing it when the bad thing happens, it'll be too late. So I wanted to leave plenty of time in this one to now open this up to the whole floor for an open Q&A session. And I'm hoping that people do have questions because this is going to be an integral part of the talk. So, okay, yes, that was. How long have you been waiting on that question?
Well, I have been waiting for it because it's a really valid question. So with Diffie-Hellman,
yes,
we are not using the certificates of private public.
I think he's about to be given a microphone. There we go.
Thank you. So with Diffie-Hellman, we are not using the private public key pair in the key exchange.
Yes.
So why do I have to bother with creating certificates still for my web service?
Everyone always really hates certificates, don't they? And I totally understand why. And literally my training and consultancy is on how to get certificates and deploy them. So I understand exactly why people don't like that. The certificate provides something different. So the certificate within the construct of a TLS connection like that provides authentication of the server's identity. So when I connect to the server, the certificate comes back to me as the client and says, I am Netflix.com because look, I have a certificate that proves I am Netflix.com. And validation of the certificate is actually the very first thing that we'll do in a connection. If I open a connection to you, you're Netflix.com. If I open the connection to you, I say, like hello Netflix.com, and the first thing that happens is you send me the certificate. Because if you're not Netflix.com, there's no point doing anything else. So the first thing that I need to know is, are you actually Netflix.com? So you send me the certificate, I validate that you are who you claim to be, and then we do the key exchange, because then we need to create an encryption key to encrypt the movie that I'm about to watch. So they serve fundamentally different purposes. But I guess that's really also part of the problem in that the purpose of the certificate and the asymmetric key pair is to do authentication. And we're like, oh, well, we have this key pair to do authentication and do this thing, and we'll also use it for this other purpose as well. Arguably, if we looked at that and had separation of interest, we should have never used the authentication key to protect session key material. It's not a multi-purpose key, and it should never have been. But it was, and we did. So that's why you still have to have certificates, I'm sorry. You have to get them and deploy them still. Yes, hello there. Oh, sorry, just a microphone on the way.
Thank you. Just a quick question. Diffie-Hellman is not secure against man-in-the-middle attack, is it?
Yes. So like in the scenario that we were talking about with the NSA sat in the middle or insert other government
Or
agency.
whatever, maybe the NSA, like government agents.
Yeah, so no, it is the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, even if you use the old version, which is the one that we just looked at, even from a security standpoint, there's still no valid concerns, assuming that you've configured it properly. The prime that we used was tiny. That should be like a 2048-bit prime. But if you use sufficiently strong values, then yes, it's secure. It's as secure as any other primitive in that we're hoping it will take decades with a supercomputer to break it. So it achieves an equivalent level of security. There was another hand I saw just there, please.
You've mentioned that we should be using forms of security that ahead of them being compromised. And by we, I interpret that to mean society.
The royal we.
The royal we, yes. Let me phrase the question.
That's all right.
What you've described is beyond the everyday experience of probably most developers, right? Mm-hmm. Most developers don't get involved in this kind of stuff. And if you extend that to the wider population, the number of people in that wider population that understand this and are aware of this is going to be vanishingly small, is to be zero, more or less. Who do they trust? I mean, we mentioned somebody's mentioned Google, we've mentioned quantum computers. Google are working on quantum computers, presumably with the intention of selling them to the NSA and the people who have deep enough pockets to pay for these things. How does wider society, who do they look to act as the guardian of their secrets? Because they can't do it themselves, but it seems like there are no honest brokers that are going to act on their behalf.
It's a tough one, and you could chop the answer into, like, I could answer that from several different angles. So looking at you as a consumer, and I agree that consumers should not have to concern themselves with these things. It should not be something that a typical consumer has to think about. Certainly in the security sector, we've been really bad at that historically by expecting and demanding users to have particular security knowledge in order to be safe. The systems and the technology should do that without them. But you already kind of make that decision around who you trust by the device that you use. For example, can I ask what phone do you use? So you're on an Android phone, and it's like from Samsung, is it a Google phone? So it's a Sony. So you've already made the decision, really, like maybe not consciously, that I trust this vendor to provide me a device that will operate in a secure fashion. So you've already really made the choice on who you trust because you're using their device, and I assume that you have social media apps, email apps, banking apps, right? Like, so you're already putting all your data into this device. So in a way, you've already made that decision. And maybe you've not made it consciously. And maybe as time goes by and people have become, like the general population have become much more aware of security and privacy online, maybe that is now consciously influencing their decisions. But in terms of the consumer, that's how they make their decision. What device am I using? Where am I going to put my data and my passwords and my bank details and everything into? From the technology side, I don't like the answer should be the government, but I find myself increasingly more skeptical there because I spent over the 2022 and 2023, I've spent a lot of time in Brussels fighting against some new legislation coming through the EU where effectively which one? Yeah, the quacks in the EU. So I've literally been to Brussels multiple times to fight against this because it would essentially, whilst not directly their intent, it would essentially give each state within the EU the ability to decrypt encrypted internet traffic. And apparently this is an unfortunate byproduct of this technology that we're proposing. And I was like, okay, then just take it out. That's pretty easy to fix. So I don't think the answer is as easy as, well, the governments should protect us and create laws that protect us and mandate things that protect us. So now where I think most people are is looking to the correct companies and thinking, I have to say, like, Apple have done a particularly really good job recently in terms of protecting data on the device, protecting data in transit, which is TLS that we're talking about. The level of encryption that they mandate now for my iPhone to send and receive data is phenomenal. And it doesn't matter what the data is. It's like, it's all of my data. So I think it's going to keep being like that. Like if you think about Apple's advertisements, I started noticing this quite a few years ago now, But historically, it was like the best camera or the brightest screen. And now it's like, we're the most secure phone. We're the most private phone. We will look after your data the best. That's a real shift in their marketing. And they must do that because they think that that's important to consumers. So I think ultimately it will be you and the decisions that you make that will guide this.
Yeah, you're quite right. I did make those decisions already. But you may be a lot more scared now after watching your talk.
Yeah, for sure. And this is why, it's like, my goal is never to, to scare people. Some of the things that I say may be scary, but the underlying goal is to just let you know that these things exist, let what's coming, what's happening, and really just so you can make better decisions. If you make more informed decisions in the long run, that's the best thing. Yeah, another question over here, please. Am I good on time? I've got like 5 more minutes. Sorry? Okay, cool. Nice.
Yeah, so it's more of a more technical question, but there are multiple versions of TLS and Cipher suites, and some of them has been recently considered not secure, even though they still use elliptic curves and things like that. So maybe you could share a couple words on that.
Yeah, we've had... It's kind of an interesting one because if you look at since like the dawn of encryption on the web in 1994 and where we are now, you could make the argument that we've had a really significant amount of change, but you could also make the argument that we've really not changed a lot at all, actually. So, I mean, we're on TLS 1.3 now, is the latest protocol version. So we had SSL 2 and 3, and then we had 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3, and we've only got those last 2 now. So the only 2 protocols that you should be supporting for encrypted comms on the internet are TLS 1.2 and 1.3. So, in terms of the history there, SSL 2 was broken whilst in production we were using it. SSL 3 was broken in production while we were using it. TLS 1.1 and 1.0 are now deprecated. And it was the first time that we properly deprecated a cryptographic primitive before it was broken. So I'm hoping, that's like a little bit of optimism, but I'm hoping that that signals the change in the way that we do things. Rather than waiting till something is broken that we're depending on in production, everybody has to come to work on a Sunday and immediately patch. I'm hoping now that we can start deprecating and phasing things out as they come to their end of life. And we're doing the same with the Cipher suites. If you look at a good TLS 1.2 configuration, you could probably write like 200, 220 Cipher suites off the top of my head. In TLS 1.3, you have 5. It's like, so you can't, you've got 200 Cipher suites, 180 of them are bad, and you shouldn't use them, 20 of them are good. Statistically, you're going to make a lot of errors. If you look at TLS 1.3, we just took the 5 excellent ones and said, this is the only choice that you have. You can't screw it up. And I like that because I'm good at screwing things up. This is why Diffie-Hellman and forward secrecy is so important. You've got to keep this key a secret forever. I'm human. I'm going to screw things up. Give me a thing that I can't screw up. So we're finally getting to a point where we've really matured in the crypto space. Now we just need to disseminate all of these new technologies, these new protocols and primitives. So the answers are already there. The question is, can we get them more broadly deployed than we have now? Time for one more question. Right at the back over there. Sorry, I'm going to make you go long distance.
With quantum computing, is it just its ability to mathematically break Diffie-Hellman, or is there some other attribute of quantum computing that breaks our current encryption?
Essentially, like the base comparison comes down to just raw compute power, because they can do. So if we go back to like when I gave you this slide here, and I was like, right, work, with just the parameters, tell me S. Now, in a classical computer, you will be able to try one set of parameters at a time, right? Try this one, it's wrong, try this one, it's wrong. Quantum computers will be able to do many, many tests at the same time per computation. So it just comes down to efficiency. They can do it significantly quicker because they do it differently. So it's the same process, like they're not doing something different in that regard. It's just like how damn efficient they're going to be, because they will be able to test multiple parameters where a classic computer would have only been able to do one. So it just comes down to time reduction because of that efficiency. All right, I'm going to wrap it up there. I don't see any more questions, but if there were, come find me afterwards. I'll be hanging around for the next few days, and thank you for coming.